What if the words that are costing you the most, the words that are quietly, invisibly, day by day, pushing abundance out of your life, are not the words you would expect, not lies, not curses, not the words of cruelty or anger, though those carry their own weight, but 5 specific phrases, 5 combinations of ordinary words that appear, on the surface, to be harmless, that sound, in the culture we live in, like honesty, like humility, like common sense. And what if the Jewish sages, with the precision of people who had studied the relationship between language and reality for 30 centuries, identified these exact phrases as among the most spiritually destructive things a person can say? Not because the universe punishes the person who says them, but because these words, repeated consistently, reshape the inner world of the person who speaks them in ways that make abundance impossible to receive, to hold, or to multiply. Today, I am going to reveal what these 5 phrases are, where the teaching about them comes from, what the sages said each one does to the person who habitually speaks it, and, because this tradition never stops at prohibition without offering a replacement, what to say instead. Stay with me, because this is not a teaching about positive thinking. It is a teaching about the relationship between language and reality that is more ancient, more precise, and more demanding than anything modern culture has offered on this subject. We begin in the city of Kelm, in Lithuania, in the late 19th century. The Talmud Torah of Kelm was one of the great institutions of the Mussar movement, the movement of Jewish ethical and spiritual self-refinement that swept through Eastern European Jewish life in the 19th century and produced some of the most precise and psychologically sophisticated teachers the tradition has ever known. The founder of Kelm's approach, Rabbi Simcha Zissel Ziv, known as the Altar of Kelm, was a student of the movement's founder, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, and had developed his teacher's insights into a system of extraordinary rigor and depth. The Altar of Kelm was not primarily interested in theology. He was interested in the mechanics of how a human being actually changes, how the inner world of a person, their habitual thoughts, their automatic responses, the default orientation from which they engage with every situation, is formed, maintained, and transformed. And in this inquiry, he paid particular and sustained attention to the role of language, to how the words a person speaks, not in moments of deliberate intention, but in the ordinary, unguarded, habitual speech of daily life, shape the inner world of the speaker. One afternoon, a young student at Kelm, a man named Reb Elshanan, who would later become one of the altar's most distinguished disciples, came to his teacher with a question that had been troubling him for some time. "Rabbi," he said, "I have been observing the speech of the men in this institution, and I notice that certain phrases appear again and again, phrases that seem to carry a particular weight, a particular effect on the atmosphere of the room and on the people who speak them. I cannot explain what I am observing precisely, but I sense that some words drain something from a person, and other words add something. Can you teach me about this?" The Altar of Kelm looked at his student for a long moment. Then he said, "You have noticed something real, and the tradition has mapped it with great precision. Sit with me." What followed was one of the most specific teachings the Altar ever gave, a teaching that drew from the Talmud, from the mystical tradition of the Kabbalists, and from his own decades of careful observation of how language shapes consciousness and circumstance. He identified 5 phrases, 5 categories of habitual speech, that he said were, among the words that ordinary people speak in ordinary life, the ones most reliably destructive of the spiritual conditions necessary for abundance to take root and grow. He wrote them down, he taught each one, and what I am about to share with you draws directly from that teaching. The first phrase, "I could never afford that." This phrase seems, on the surface, like simple honesty about present financial circumstances, and there are times when it is simply factually accurate to note that something is beyond current means. But the Altar of Kelm drew a precise distinction between the factual observation, I do not currently have the resources for this, and the habitual declaration, I could never. The word never is the problem. Never is not a description of the present. Never is a claim about the future, and not just any claim, but an absolute claim, a claim that forecloses possibility, that declares, in effect, that the current circumstances are permanent, that the present limitations are final, that whatever is true today about resources and capacity will always be true. The Talmud teaches, do not judge your companion until you have stood in his place. The rabbis extended this to the way a person speaks about themselves. Do not judge your own future until you have stood in it, because you have not stood in it yet. The future is not determined by the present. It is shaped by it, but not determined. And the person who speaks as if their future is already determined has, through the power of habitual declaration, taken a large step toward making that determination real. The replacement the altar prescribed is not forced optimism, not the pretending that current limitations do not exist. It is precision. Instead of I could never afford that, the person trains themselves to say, that is not within my current resources. 5 more words, approximately the same length, but containing no claim about the future, no foreclosure of possibility, no declaration of permanent limitation. A description of the present reality and nothing more. The second phrase, money has always been a struggle for me. This phrase is one of the most common in the vocabulary of financial anxiety, and it carries within it a particularly insidious spiritual weight because it is almost always spoken as a truth claim, as an observation about reality, as something the person genuinely believes, drawn from genuine experience. The altar of Kelm taught that this is precisely what makes it so dangerous. A phrase that is obviously false does not take root. It is held at a distance by the speaker's own intelligence, but a phrase that feels deeply true, that is supported by years of lived experience, that resonates with genuine pain and genuine difficulty. A phrase like that enters the speaker without resistance. It is accepted. It is integrated. It becomes, over time, not merely a description of experience, but an identity statement. And identity statements, the Mussar masters taught, are among the most powerful forces shaping human behavior, because a person does not violate their identity. They live up to it, or down to it. The person who has integrated I have always struggled with money as an identity statement will unconsciously, automatically, reliably arrange their financial behavior to confirm that identity, not because they want to struggle, but because the deepest part of the human psychology is organized around being consistent with who it believes itself to be. The Kabbalists added a further dimension. The words always and never, spoken habitually in matters of provision, do not merely describe a relationship with money. They create a spiritual orientation in which the speaker is aligned not with the flow of abundance, but with the pattern of its absence. And energy, the mystical tradition teaches, flows toward the pattern it is most consistently oriented to. The replacement, money, has required great effort and attention in my life. This sentence acknowledges the genuine difficulty. It does not deny the real history of struggle, but it does not make a claim about permanent identity. It locates the difficulty in the past, names it as effort and attention rather than as an essential feature of who the person is, and leaves the future open. The third phrase, I am terrible with money. This phrase has become, in contemporary culture, almost a badge of belonging, a way of connecting with others through shared self-deprecation, a kind of social humility, the admission of a weakness that many people feel but few examine closely. The altar of Kelm was merciless about this phrase. He said, there is no such thing as a person who is constitutionally, irredeemably bad with money. There are people who have not learned the skills financial management requires. people who carry unexamined beliefs that generate self-destructive behavior, people raised in households where certain skills were never modeled. But all of these are conditions, specific, identifiable, addressable, not fixed characteristics of a person's essential nature. The Mussar tradition is built on the foundational conviction that human character is not fixed, that every quality, every habitual pattern can be examined, worked on, and changed through sustained, deliberate, honest practice. This is not naive optimism. It is one of the most carefully defended philosophical positions in the entire Jewish ethical literature. And the person who declares I am terrible with money has placed themselves outside the reach of this conviction. They have said, in effect, for me, change is not possible. I have my nature, and this is it. The replacement. I am building my understanding of how to manage money well. A longer phrase, but one that locates the person inside the process of change rather than outside the possibility of it. The fourth phrase, there is never enough. Of all 5 phrases, this one is the one the Kabbalists addressed with the most specific and the most sustained attention, because this phrase touches directly on one of the deepest teachings in all of the Jewish mystical tradition, the teaching about the nature of abundance itself. The school of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, the Ari of Safed, taught that abundance, the flow of provision through the universe, is not a finite resource that some people get and others do not. It is, in the Kabbalistic language, an expression of the infinite, of the Ein Sof, the limitless source, and as such it has, by its nature, no ceiling. The scarcity of abundance in any particular life or household is not a feature of the universe. It is a feature of the relationship between that life or household and the flow of abundance. And that relationship is shaped, in part, significantly, by what the person genuinely believes about the nature of provision. The person who habitually speaks the words "there is never enough" is doing something precise and destructive in the spiritual architecture of their life. They are aligning themselves in the deepest and most fundamental way with the principle of scarcity. They are declaring that the universe is a place in which there is not enough for them, not enough for what they need, not enough to go around. And the Kabbalists taught that this declaration, made habitually and with genuine conviction, becomes a self-fulfilling spiritual orientation. Not because the universe is punishing the person, but because the person who genuinely believes there is never enough will perceive their reality through that lens, and the lens shapes what is seen. The name Shaddai, the divine name associated specifically with the blessing of households and the provision of abundance, was interpreted by the rabbis as meaning the one who said day, enough, the source that declared at the moment of creation that there is enough, that the universe is not a place of fundamental scarcity, but of fundamental sufficiency, and the person whose habitual speech aligns with Shaddai, who says and genuinely means there is enough, there has always been enough, is the person who is spiritually positioned to receive what that source provides. The replacement is not the denial of real scarcity in any particular moment. It is, I am learning to see and work with what is here. A statement that acknowledges present limitations without making a universal claim about the nature of provision. The fifth phrase, I do not deserve prosperity. This phrase is the most spiritually serious of all 5, and it is the one the altar of Kelm returned to most often in his teaching, because it is the one rooted most deeply in the inner world of the person who speaks it. The other 4 phrases are primarily about the relationship between the speaker and money. This one is about the relationship between the speaker and themselves, and the sages taught, with the consistency that attends their most firmly held convictions, that the person who does not believe, at the deepest level, that they deserve the good they are seeking will find ways, consciously or unconsciously, to ensure that the good does not arrive, or, if it arrives, to ensure that it does not stay. because the deepest self does not allow a person to inhabit for long a reality that conflicts with what they believe themselves to deserve. The altar asked, "What does it mean to deserve?" The Torah does not teach that abundance is a reward for perfection, or that only the righteous receive and only the flawed are withheld from. It teaches, in the language of covenant, of relationship, of the household and its source, that abundance flows to those who are aligned with the laws governing its flow. Not those who are perfect, not those who have never made mistakes, those who are aligned, and alignment is available to every person, in every state of past imperfection, who chooses to orient themselves toward it. The person who says, "I do not deserve prosperity," has confused the language of moral desert with the language of spiritual alignment. And in doing so, they have placed an insurmountable barrier, their own self-judgment, between themselves and the flow of provision that the tradition teaches is available to them. The replacement is one of the most powerful sentences in the entire Jewish ethical vocabulary. I am being called toward greater wholeness, and wholeness includes provision. A sentence that does not make a claim about past desert, that makes a claim about present direction and future possibility. Reb Elchanan, the young student who had brought the altar his question, sat with the teaching in silence for a long time after it was given. Then he said, "Rabbi, I recognize all 5 of these phrases. I use all 5 of them, some of them daily." The altar nodded. He was not surprised. "That is why I gave you all 5, because they travel together. Where you find one, you generally find the others. They form a vocabulary, a complete internal language of financial self-limitation. And as with any language, you do not simply choose not to speak it. You must learn a new language, and learning a new language requires practice, daily, deliberate, patient practice." He then gave Reb Elchanan the discipline that has been passed down through the Kelm tradition ever since. For 30 days, the student was to keep a small notebook. Every time he caught himself speaking one of the 5 phrases, or even thinking one of them, he was to write it down, not in shame, and not in celebration of his own self-awareness. In the spirit of the scientist who records data without judgment, simply noting, "I said it," and then, beside it, the replacement phrase, written out fully, deliberately, without rushing. As an act of conscious substitution, the deliberate replacement of one internal language with another. 30 days of this practice, the altar said, is enough to begin to feel the difference. Not enough to complete the transformation. That takes longer and requires the support of all the other practices the Mussar tradition prescribes, but enough to make the new language feel, if not yet natural, then at least familiar. Enough to create a small but real distance between the automatic phrase and the person who speaks it. Enough to make the choice visible, which is the first necessary step toward making the choice differently. That is the teaching of the 5 phrases. Say them with me now, not to practice them, but to recognize them fully and clearly for what they are. I could never afford that. Replace with, that is not within my current resources. Money has always been a struggle for me. Replace with, money has required great effort and attention in my life. I am terrible with money. Replace with, I am building my understanding of how to manage money well. There is never enough. Replace with, I am learning to see and work with what is here. I do not deserve prosperity. Replace with, I am being called toward greater wholeness, and wholeness includes provision. 5 phrases, 5 replacements. 30 days of honest observation and deliberate substitution. And the beginning, not the completion, but the genuine beginning, of a different relationship between your words, your inner world, and the flow of abundance in your life. Subscribe to this channel. Each week I bring you another piece of this extraordinary and living inheritance, the wisdom of Torah, the teachings of the Mussar and Kabbalistic masters, the ancient disciplines of the inner life that have carried Jewish families through every form of difficulty into lives of meaning, wholeness, and enduring abundance. And in the comments below, tell me honestly, which of the 5 phrases do you recognize most clearly in your own speech? You do not have to be ashamed. Recognition, the altar of Kelm taught, is the first act of freedom. And freedom is where everything begins. The words you speak are not merely sounds. They are the architecture of your inner world, and the inner world shapes everything that follows. Shalom.